picture, and underneath we can be groupies and rodents and stuff like that. And this is my ambition. So I have to start with kind of a guilty confession that I totally stole the title for this talk. So I'm just going to make a clean breast of it right now. Although not exactly in this form, I was up at the Graduate Theological Union Library a couple weeks ago, and I came across a book by an anthropologist, and the title of it was, Can Islam Be French? It was a study of, now just track with me for a minute here, it was a study of Muslims living in France, and it addressed the question of, can a traditional monotheistic religion thrive in a secular, postmodern European climate, and what happens to it? And so it was a study of how French Muslims think about Islam now that they're French. I thought it was a pretty interesting concept, and immediately my mind turned to my local zip code. And the question that formed in me was, well then, can Berkeley be Christian? Because that's really kind of the question that everything revolves around. Whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, at least in a Christian community like this, that's the defining notion in our lives. Can it really sort of happen? And that question fits well in the series of talks that we've worked through this month on the topic of faith and culture. I opened the series in Acts chapter 17, where we're going to return today, by looking at the questions that culture poses to us. And they're basically, what are you saying exactly, and what does that mean? Then Alan followed up by looking at the ways that faith and science actually can not only be friends, but can help to bring out the best in each other. Then last Sunday morning, Mark answered the defining question of our time: would Jesus own a smartphone? And he pointed out a challenge to us, which was, are we using our technology to serve other people or just to serve ourselves? Pretty good question there. And so today we're going to return to Acts chapter 17 and ask, is it really a live option that Berkeley could be Christian? Or is the best we can hope for to sort of form faith communities that are kind of bomb shelters where we hunker down to endure the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, which some days constitute the environment that we live in, or the 500-mile-an-hour headwind that we sometimes compare it to. And so we sort of, if you will, like prisoners in a state penitentiary, do our time in Berkeley, get what we can out of it, and then move on to do the rest of our life in an easier place. And in this time, try to just hold on to our faith with two hands, white-knuckle desperation, and in a sense, freeze ourselves in place, hoping to be defrosted somewhere where it's a lower level of challenge. You know, if you adopt that perspective, then you know what you'll do to serve the Lord in Berkeley? Nothing. Your level of accomplishment in the city will be zero, because that's a survivalist mentality. Acts chapter 17 is the story of a conservative Jewish rabbi who was a follower of Jesus. His name was Paul, and he ended up entering a community that was in some ways kind of like ours. In a lot of sources historically that I've read about the city, Berkeley is called the Athens of the Pacific. And today, we're going to find Paul in the city of Athens in an encounter with a culture that's not really terribly unlike ours. The reason that comparison is also often drawn between our city and Athens is that both were major university towns, both were highly pluralistic environments, both were very intellectual. We're aware of both high science here and pop culture here and all the spiritual options in between. Athens was the same way. Pretty much everybody was a materialist philosophically, but some were rationalist, sort of empirical materialists, and some were sort of pantheist spiritual types. The only thing that they agreed on was that the idea of the resurrection from the dead was completely ridiculous and the worst idea that they had ever heard. But all of those options were in town. And in both communities, ours and this ancient city, people felt that they were pretty special. When we moved here, we spent a year just looking for a place to live so we could live in the city limits, because we knew to Berkeleyans that makes a difference. Sitting in a coffee house in one of our very first face-to-face encounters with a local citizen, a guy got right up in my face, and the first thing he said to me was, "Where are you from and who are you with?" Like you thought I was with the CIA or something. I was an undercover FBI operative looking for leftover radicals from the 60s who had never been caught for bombing some classroom building or something like that. And we told him, well, we're with a network of churches called the Assemblies of God. We're here to start a new congregation. He's, oh, all right. He's okay with it. You know, it's like, why all that heavy pressure? And what I realized, it's an identity thing. There's something about being from here. And the Athenians were the same thing. They believed they had risen up out of the sacred soil of Greece. And as a result, their existence there was itself sacralized. It made them special and distinct from the rest of the world. So the parallels, while they're certainly not 100%, are significant enough that the story really, I think, has something to say to us. Now, how does a Jewish rabbi end up in a place like this? And the only answer, really, that the scripture gives us is he's on the run from his enemies. He incurs so much religious opposition because of his announcement of the death and resurrection of Jesus that Paul is literally chased across the country of Greece to the point where he's in so much danger, his friends actually do him the favor of hiding him in Athens all alone. And so when he arrives in the city, he goes to the synagogue, he talks about Jesus being the Messiah among the Jews, he goes out into the marketplace, he meets the Gentiles, and he makes tents, which is how he makes his living at the time. And in the course of all of that, he meets some of the local philosophers, because the one thing the Greeks had in surplus was philosophers. They had really no army, there's only 10,000 people in town, the place is totally beaten down, but everybody there was really smart. Athens is the size of Emeryville. I mean, I don't know what you see in your mind when you read these passages in the Bible, but it's like, take Emeryville and put the Acropolis there, that's Athens. That's all there was to it. And there's, this tiny population, but everybody's really super smart, and so they hear about him talking about the resurrection, and they completely radically disagree with him for every reason you could name. Plus, they're addicted to novelty, and this is a brand new idea. And so it's really the local philosophers that, just as his friends hustled him away to Athens, now his opponents hustle him up the hill of the marketplace to a place called the Areopagus, where Paul is now going to stand in front of a committee that will decide whether he can be licensed to speak about this truth in the city of Athens. The Greeks prided themselves on their openness to absolutely everything. And then as soon as someone showed up with a new idea, they called a committee meeting. You see, everyone's openness has boundaries. The only question is which set of boundaries that you have. I was invited recently to give what was called a spiritual moment at a community function, a large luncheon held in a well-known building with our mayor and a number of other city officials present. And so I gave a spiritual moment, and in so doing, I read a quotation from Jesus from the Gospel of Matthew, and I prayed, not on behalf of anybody else, just me personally, and I did so in the name of Jesus. And oh man, did I get in trouble. Wow, there were phone calls at night and emails, and let me be very clear, everybody was very nice about it. It wasn't hostile or angry, or it was completely appropriate. But I was thinking, woo, wait a minute, I thought we were open to anything around here. But apparently there are limits in terms of what is considered appropriate in public settings, and they called a committee meeting. I didn't have to go or anything, but I did have to kind of give an account of myself and why I had done this. And my basic reason was, if you ask a Christian pastor for a spiritual moment, you're going to get a Christian spiritual moment. And I would respect a representative of another faith and expect that from them. What I discovered was that here in Athens, when you get people of diverse points of views together, spirituality is only appropriate if it's done in a way that is general enough to mean anything to anyone. Which I understand that, I get that. I'm not, criticizing or trying to disrespect that. I'm just saying it's a different point of view, which we have to come to terms with. And so now I'm in the process of rethinking, what do I do now exactly if I'm asked to do something public? And so I'm consulting with people who are chaplains in the military who face this situation all the time and trying to get a handle on, within the grounds of my conscience and the Bible, which I believe to be completely authoritative, how do we approach those things? So even here,
we have to work through this kind of stuff. So the philosophers, all the smart people, drag him in front of the committee. The Areopagus is both a place. If the marketplace is the mall, this meeting takes place at Starbucks. They pull a bunch of tables together. It's also a group of people, and the way you got to be on it was that you retired from a position in the city government. So the whole civil service, upon retirement, becomes eligible to be part of this group. It's all men. A self-respecting Greek woman would not be seen in this environment in the first century. And so Paul is taken there and given an opportunity to address these people. If you said you were representing a new god that no one had heard about, the Athenians had an application process. It wasn't a written application process, but they had 3 criteria that you had to meet to introduce a new god into the city. And remember, the reason he's pulled in front of this committee is because he's introduced strange or foreign divinities, Jesus and the resurrection. Because the word resurrection is a feminine word, it's possible that they thought the new god he was introducing was Jesus and his female consort, Resurrectiona. And there were 2 new deities being represented here, so that means 2 applications. Here's the criteria you had to meet. Number 1, the deity had to have a spokesperson. In other words, it couldn't just be a cloud of spiritual energy floating around. Some human had to come before the Areopagus and physically represent the deity. This was your press secretary, your campaign manager. The second criteria was that the deity had to want to be part of the city, had to be highly motivated to be among the Athenians. Remember, they had idols as commonly as we have ATMs in our city out on the street. One scholar calls Athens a place with a, quote, forest of idols. And the third thing the deity had to want was to bless the city and not to do evil to it. In other words, if you're coming representing a deity from another country that wants to curse us, we will not allow you in town. And so the human spokesman had to come to represent this new god. And so this is probably the second thing that's going on other than being licensed to speak in public. So in that situation, what do you say? What does a perfectly self-respecting Jewish rabbi say to a group of people who believe that his core idea is complete madness and who is seen as the campaign manager for another idol to be added to the list that they already have? Well, let's find out. In Acts chapter 17, the easiest way to follow this along, because the passage is fairly long, is actually in a Bible if you've got one electronically. If not, there's one in the seat back right in front of you where it's on page 602. Isn't that handy? The address starts in verse 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. And here's this reason. For I passed along and observed the objects of your worship. I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God." When he says passed along, the original language means there I looked and looked and looked. In other words, I've been walking all over town, and everywhere I go, I see these idols. Archaeologists tell us that commonly in Athens in this era, almost every home, in fact, had a square-shaped column out front with a head of the god Hermes on top of it, who represented the god of houses and streets and intersections. And so you're literally stumbling over these things all the time. He puts all of this together and says, you guys are extremely devoted to religious things. And I can simply see that with my own simple observation. In fact, you even have an altar to an unknown God. One ancient geographer and one ancient philosopher both confirmed the presence of these kinds of altars in Athens. And there are a lot of legends the Greeks had about where they came from. There was one legend that said that these altars to unknown gods were erected to honor the graves of people who were disturbed by new building projects in the city. And so with each new wave of construction, more and more of these went up. Now it reads to us like that there's one of these. There were probably many, many of them. That there was another legend that said that during a plague in the city, the Greeks were unable to stop the disease, and so they consulted a prophet in another land who said, well, take black and white sheep into the center of the city and drive them outward, and wherever they stop, kill them there, sacrifice them, and erect an altar. And that these altars to unknown gods were the leftovers of that ritual. Being involved in religious observance of this sort was considered to be something that educated people did in the ancient world. And so by making these observations, what Paul is really saying is, I recognize that you're smart, that you're highly developed, that you're educated, that you're cosmopolitan kind of people, and that I'm cosmopolitan enough to recognize that and to know what that means. You see what he's doing? He's putting himself on the same page with them before he starts to talk about where they can go from their starting point. Then in verse 24 he says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. That last phrase is probably a fragment from Euripides. Ancient literature very seldom uses citation. He just trusts that his audience will recognize the words. He goes on in verse 25, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Talk about a two-edged sword. A Jewish rabbi has now announced that the God of the world does not need the temple in Jerusalem. In other words, he's saying that we're all playing out of the same book here. That there isn't one set of rules for me and another set of rules for you. But all of those sacrifices and things that were made there in Jerusalem for all those years now, they've all been superseded by the coming of Jesus and his once and for all time sacrifice on the cross. And so just as I'm not going to ask future generations to all go to worship in Jerusalem, I'm going to ask you to consider whether or not going to these pieces of wood and stone in your city streets are really where you're going to find God. See how he's edging closer and closer and closer to what he has come to announce to them. Verse 26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all of the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way. The original language has the sense of groping in the dark. Perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, yet he's actually not far from each one of us. When I walk down Shattuck Avenue, when I cross the Cal campus, when I'm standing in Sproul Plaza, when I'm listening to the music and smelling the hashish in the air at the BART station, any BART station, this is the line I think I need to keep in my mind. Yet, he is actually not far from each one of us. We can never evaluate based on outside observation how close or far anyone is from God. Sometimes the person who looks maybe the wildest and the most out of control to me or to you is really the person whose heart is so closely inclined to the Lord and is just inches away. Maybe tomorrow is the day that they'll put arms of faith around the God who's reaching for them with arms of love. God is close, 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 close. And the apostle has told the Athenians the whole reason that God has formed human civilization, and we could then, I think, say by extension human culture, is because that is a vehicle for us to search for God. In other words, the purpose of human culture is to reflect the glory of God. The purpose of human culture, every human culture, every subculture, is a search party organized to look for God. Whether it's a culture as diverse as the United States, whether it's a tiny urban subculture that has a costume that looks odd to you and shoes that look strange that no one has even named yet, it's just another search party organized to look for God. For in him we live, this is Epimenides, and move and have our being. It's actually Epimenides referring to Zeus. Notice how Paul strips the name Zeus out and uses the quotation anyway. One commentator says that what he's doing is he's putting these Greek poets through the laundry. He's cleaning them up. He's baptizing them, making them good Christians, and then bringing them back into his sermon. Even some of your own poets, this is Aratus, for we are indeed his offspring. He again omits the references to the other God, baptizes this piece of poetry, brings it back into his sermon. In the same way that last Sunday morning, Mark had us all take our very first real-time texting poll right here during a church service on Sunday morning. We baptized a piece of technology and brought it into our experience for the purpose of making Jesus more clear and more real, of answering the questions, what are we saying exactly, and what does this mean? So what's happening now is the apostle is actually taking their own high culture and using it as a vehicle to express Christ to them. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to go and think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. It's referring to Jesus. And this he has given assurance to all. And how has that assurance come? By raising him from the dead. So God has formed human civilization to reflect his glory like a great mirror. And every aspect of that civilization, every culture, no matter what form it takes, is a search party organized to find God. Some of those search parties go wrong. Some of the methods they use are reprehensible. Some of the things that they produce turn out to be not so great. Some people take their search in a direction that ends up being self-destructive or off into drugs or violence or all kinds of things that are so unhealthy for the whole world. But what is motivating that is this hunger. Why were the Greeks so fascinated with everything new? Why was novelty the heroine of ancient Athens? One Bible scholar suggests that it could be because their status quo didn't work at all. They had to find something new, that there was a hunger, there was a discontent, there was an emptiness, it's just something that says there's got to be more than another jolt of Starbucks and better shoes. There's got to be something more than all of this. And so the Greeks were shopping through intellectuals and philosophers and even visiting Jewish rabbis to see if anybody had a word that could bring them something more than they already had, because they were sitting. When you live on Olympus, where do you go? When you're already as far up as people can be, how can you find more? And I think sometimes people in our city feel the same way. There's a restlessness here, looking for more than we already have, either materially or philosophically. And what Paul is saying to them is that is God-given. That hunger, that's in you from God. It's part of your purpose, part of your function. And here's the thing about culture. While the culture around you will go on once you're gone, death is the end of culture for you. And with death comes judgment for everyone. And the only thing that brings us through judgment is the death and resurrection of God's Son, Jesus Christ, in whom we find God, we know God, we love God. Here's how things turned out that day. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. Well, that went well. This is probably the Epicureans who feel that death is just having your atoms scattered back to the universe from which they came. So resurrection, they're going to laugh at you. So that's bad. This is like ending a Sunday morning service and having everybody over here just laugh right out loud. Oh, it was terrible. We're never coming back. That's ridiculous. So everybody over here is laughing out loud. And then over on this side are sitting the Stoics. And what happens to them is this. Others said, we will hear you again about this. Now you can see the Stoics rubbing their chin and saying, let's consider this rationally. And so while these guys over here are throwing things at me and mocking and laughing, these guys over here say, no, not so fast. Maybe we should invite him back. It could be that there's some aspect of this that we could integrate into our own point of view, our own philosophy. So let's not be so quickly to dismiss him. And then in verse 34, but some men joined him and believed. joined there, the original word has the sense of close, intimate association. In other words, they were in all the way. They didn't sign a card and put it in an offering basket. They were really wanting to be part of this. They joined him and believed, among whom were Dionysus, the Areopagite, in other words, one of the members of the committee, and Damaris, and others with them. The word Damaris is female, it's foreign, and since no self-respecting Greek woman would be in this setting, this is probably a courtesan. In other words, this is someone's mistress. But see, in Jesus, it doesn't matter what you were. In him, it's just what you are and what you're going to be. Because in Christ, our previous life doesn't matter, does it? The wonderful thing about Jesus is it's like it never happened with him. It's not probation, it's pardon. And so the author of this book takes special pains to mention this woman. She stands out as an example of what's possible when people acknowledge that Jesus has risen from the dead. As we walk through our city, we're in the midst of a giant search party. Now, some people would say they're pursuing truth through science. Other people would say they're pursuing truth through New Age practices, through philosophy, through scholarship. And, there's a lot good about all of that. We need science, we need philosophy, we need scholarship. But all of that is coming out of a longing for and a desire to find God. Can Berkeley be Christian? Anywhere where there are so many people searching, the potential for people to find God isn't lower in my mind, it's higher. Yes. Because the same openness that leads us into all of these kinds of search is the openness that will keep our hearts open ultimately to finding God. In 1990, the Hubble Space Telescope was launched. Have you gone online and see some of the deep space pictures that the thing has taken? It's just, it's unbelievable. It makes, they look almost as good as the photos of the band. I mean, it's phenomenal. Like the Crab Nebula, the Eagle Nebula, they're just absolutely amazing. But it didn't start out so well. Once the telescope reached Earth orbit that year, and it was turned on, and the pictures came back to Earth, it was discovered that the focus of the telescope was only about 10% of what the engineers had predicted it would be. It was okay, but at these distances, being off by the tiniest amount is, well, it's nearly catastrophic because the images just can't be near the quality of what you really need them to be. And so there was a huge investigation and a big controversy about it. It was a bitter dispute between NASA and the engineering firm that had put together the device. And what was discovered was that the mirror in the telescope was not ground correctly. That around the edges of the main mirror responsible for focusing the telescope, the grinding was off by 2,200 nanometers. It was too flat around the edges by that amount. Now, how much is a nanometer? It's teeny weeny. So 2,200 of those. That was enough at these distances to throw it off to the point where it was not a complete disappointment, but it was pretty close. And so, as in a science fiction movie, astronauts launched a rescue mission, went to the Hubble Space Telescope, took a repair kit, which included ways to modify the mirror in the image, installed it all at tremendous personal risk, very elaborate, very complicated, lots of special tooling, very difficult to do, an unbelievable engineering challenge, and when they turned it back on, it was flawless. Now, when I read about that, I thought, this is exactly what's happening here. Our civilization, our culture exists to reflect the glory of God. But we do so imperfectly because we are imperfect. The death and resurrection of Jesus and who Christ represents, Jesus is like the repair to the mirror. When you put him over us, what comes through is the image of God. that image that is in every person that sits in this room and every person that walks these streets. If Berkeley can't be Christian, no place can. I want to challenge you to believe that. Because if we don't, we'll just clock our time here and move on to try to do things where it's easier. But if we believe that, I don't think there's any ceiling on what's possible here because of the kind of people who are in this town. People like you all. Commit yourself to that. Believe that God is near to everyone in our city. He's just that close to breaking through in the heart and the life of everybody we know. Let's bow our heads together. Lord Jesus, we're going to ask you